Hello! Today I would like to talk about Winston Churchill, who is probably the historical figure the most considered as a great hero. He is known for his legendary struggles and speeches during World War II. He was proclaimed by a BBC poll the greatest of all Britons. But today I want to show you that Winston Churchill is far from being a hero. Quite the opposite. Churchill was probably one of the biggest war criminals of all history. A power-hungry politician, an opportunist, a warmonger, and a sociopath. So, debunking the mythology of Churchill is very important, because his legacy has been used by so many politicians and historians to sell wars and interventions based on lies that all had dire consequences. In fact, the so-called greatness of Churchill fully reflects the quote that history is written by the victors. But in the case of Churchill, it goes beyond that, because Churchill said himself, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." So you may want to think twice before quoting Churchill in any way positive. Okay, because we talk about Churchill, we talk about the Second World War, which is considered to be a good and necessary war. A statement I strongly disagree with. And I'm not a supporter of Hitler or Nazism. No, I'm a libertarian. So this is all from a libertarian perspective. I believe in the non-aggression principle, that initiating the use of violence is wrong, and that the free market is the best system. For me, the role of the state, if ever there is one, should be limited to protect individuals, property, and contracts. So I don't like the Nazis, the same way I don't like US and British imperialism, or even worse, communism. I stand against the intervention in World War II, which I think precipitated the downfall of Western civilization. I also want to say that I don't know everything and I could be wrong, so you are welcome to... Everyone is welcome if you want to have an open and polite discussion about this. So let's start. Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born in 1874. His father was from aristocratic origin. Churchill's love for war started quite early. He had a collection of 1,500 toy soldiers and he played with them up to an age that most boys stopped playing with that. And when he played with his brother, this one was only allowed to have non-British soldiers and no artillery. His relationship with his father was distant, and he complained that his mother visited him rarely when he was at the boarding school. I'm not an expert in child psychology, but I think that not feeling loved by its parents is a very bad start, especially when we know that Churchill was a big alcoholic. So, Winston joined the Army Cadets at the age of 13. Then he went to a military academy and came out as second lieutenant. He participated in some combats and was even captured, but he managed to escape. In 1900, for the first time, he was elected as an MP with the Conservative Party, but in 1904 he went with the Liberals, and later he joined the Conservatives again. In fact, if Churchill had any allegiance, it was for power. His political positions often changed according to what benefited him the most, like getting a cabinet post or simply be with the party in power. Churchill occupied many cabinet positions. He was Minister of the Navy, of Munitions, of War, of Colonies, and of Finances. He finally became Prime Minister in 1940 and again in 1951. So Churchill was into politics and into state power for more than 50 years. It's not a surprise that the great libertarian historian Ralph Raico named Churchill a man of the state, of the welfare state and of the warfare state. Ralph Raico said that Churchill wished for more wars than actually happened, and also that he had no principles, except for one that was constant in his life, his love for war. Churchill was the only member of the cabinet backing the First World War from the start of the crisis. He said to Prime Minister Asquith that the last thing he would pray for was peace. Churchill was the First Lord of the Admiralty, but he lost his position of power for a while because of his responsibilities in the Gallipoli disaster. It's a failed attempt to invade Turkey that cost the lives of 250,000 troops. And after that, Churchill was on the battlefield of the First World War for a few months. So, the First World War is a terrible event with dire consequences for mankind. It was an imperialist war, not a noble cause for freedom or justice. The Allies consisted of the two biggest colonial powers, and of Tsarist Russia, who was an autocratic and oppressive regime. The Allies had secret treaties unknown to their people. Germany was a rising power who wanted to get colonies. But the idea that Germany was the sole responsible for the war is absurd and false. Everyone had its share of guilt. Also, if you look at a map of Europe, Germany is obviously the nation that may feel the most threatened. I mean, it's surrounded and has access to fewer resources. Also, once Russia started to mobilize and the threat became real, Germany had not any real choice other than try to knock out France rapidly and then turn to face Russia. This is important because the war ended with the Versailles Treaty, the very unfair Versailles Treaty, that considered Germany to be the sole responsible and who had to pay huge reparations to the Allies. The treaty also restricted Germany from having an army, and some of the German territories were given to Poland and Czechoslovakia and to some other nations. This very bad ending of the war is one of the major causes for the rise of Hitler and the Second World War in Europe. And the reason why the war ended this way instead of a stalemate was because the United States had intervened on the Allies' side. And in reaction to this, and as a last-ditch effort, the German government sent Vladimir Lenin in Russia in the hope he would destabilize the Eastern Front to stop the war. This way Germany could concentrate all of its might on the Western Front before the American troops arrived. The Russian Revolution and Lenin brought to power an horrible system that caused the death of over 100 million people in the 20th century. So you see, the First World War, the Versailles Treaty, Hitler, Nazism, Lenin, Stalin, communism. And Churchill, the great hero, cheered for this war before it even started, and Britain was never threatened. Churchill was ready to violate neutral countries like Belgium, which was illegal. But Germany invaded Belgium, which was the reason why Britain entered the war. You can see that hypocrisy is there right from the start. Churchill made cut the underwater cable who linked Germany to the United States, so the Americans would only get a British view of the war. A reason that helped the selling of the war in the United States was the sinking of the Lusitania, a ship with American passengers who carried munition in secret and who was sunk by a German submarine. 1 week before the sinking, Churchill wrote that it was important to attract neutral ships to Great Britain's shore, especially the United States, in the hope of embroiling them with Germany. There is no direct proof that Churchill arranged for the sinking of the Lusitania, but according to Ralph Raico, his policy made the sinking most likely. The British Admiralty knew that German U-boats were informed of the sailing of the Lusitania, but there is no records of any warning, and none of the available destroyers were sent to defend it. One of the reasons Germany decided to use submarine warfare was because Britain imposed a naval blockade on Germany. Guess who was behind that blockade, considered illegal by international law, which led to the death by starvation of more than 700,000 German civilians? Churchill himself. And the blockade continued many months after the end of the war to force Germany to sign the Versailles Treaty. Even fishing boats were forbidden to go to sea while Germans were starving. Many who survived the starvation became the most radicalized followers of Hitler. Many people of the time were able to foresee that the Versailles Treaty would bring future troubles. French Marshal Foch said it was not peace, but an armistice for 20 years. John Maynard Keynes, from whom we inherited many bad economic policies, criticized the Versailles Treaties in his book, The Economic Consequences of Peace. Even our dear Winston admitted that if Britain would have been in the same situation than Germany, he would have hoped for someone like Hitler. But again, it was a contradiction, because Churchill also admitted that he wanted to crush Germany as a rival. He told the Time of London in 1919 that if ever Germany would begin to trade again, Britain would have fought the First World War for nothing. So now let's talk about the Great Depression, which caused a lot of sufferings. The Great Depression helped the selling of communism and socialism as an alternative. It grew the power of the state, it led to some protectionism and trading wars. And it also helped Hitler to get into power by making the German people more desperate, especially after they suffered hyperinflation in 1923. The Great Depression is the direct result of the war and also of the central bank's manipulation of the money supply and the fixing of the interest rates. It caused inflation and a lot of distortion. During the 1920s, the Federal Reserve lowered its interest rate, which helped to create the stock market bubble. And the reason the Fed did that was to help Britain to get back on the gold standard at the unrealistic pre-war parity, which was very bad for trade. Murray Rothbard said that it ruined the good name of gold. Can you guess who was behind that? It was Churchill, who at the time was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He wanted the pound to look great. So it's another disaster that Churchill contributed to cause. Okay, now the Second World War. The war that most people, politicians, mainstream media, history classes in government school and Hollywood's movie considered to be the good war. And this so-called good war is greatly associated to Winston Churchill. So Hitler came to power in 1933. I showed you that the Allies and Churchill are quite responsible for that. With the Versailles Treaty, the starving, the stripping of German territories, the limitation of military, and the occupation of the Ruhr to extract resources. But we must mention that Germany also received help from the US government. This way it could repay its debt to France and Britain, who then could repay the United States. This helped Germany to cartelize its armament industry. I just wanted to say that because you must see that governments really don't protect us. So in 1935, Hitler started to rebuild an army. In 1936, he reoccupied the Rhineland. In 1938, he annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, which is seen as the beginning of his brutal conquest that needed to be stopped. And I'm not saying that the Nazis were good and humanitarian, but saying that Germany, who was not self-sufficient in food, was already doing the most evil things by wanting to get back its land and by wanting to have an army while she is surrounded by hostile countries, is ridiculous and a hypocrite. Also, Austria is very similar to Germany for language and culture. And in 1919, the Austrian government voted in favor to unite with Germany. But it was forbidden by the Allies because, you see, self-determination was not for everyone. As for Czechoslovakia, millions of Germans in the Sudeten land were forced to live under this newly created state against their will. Again, those Germans wanted to be reunited. Those who worshipped Churchill considered that his so-called greatness is because he wanted to prevent the Germans to reunite by attacking them right there. Then, just before the beginning of the war, Hitler surprised the world by signing a non-aggression pact with Stalin. Why a surprise? Because obviously Nazi Germany's hatred and imperial ambitions were against communism and the Soviet Union. Then why this non-aggression pact that we all know Hitler betrayed in 1941? Again, the culprit of this is mostly Britain, who gave a guarantee to defend Poland in case of war with Germany. Poland also had some German land, and the Germans living there wanted to reunite with Germany. Hitler tried to negotiate, but with the might of the British Empire on its side, the Polish government refused. So Hitler, who did not want a two-fronts war, made a temporary alliance with Stalin. Hitler said, "Everything I undertake is directed against Russia. If the West is too stupid and too blind to understand this, then I will be forced to reach an understanding with the Russians, smash the West, and then turn all my concentrated strength against the Soviet Union. I need the Ukraine so that no one can starve us out again as in the last war." There are some words I repeat often about government interventions. Unintended consequences. So, September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Then, Britain and France declared war on Germany. I repeat, Britain and France declared war on Germany. It's not Germany who declared war. It's important. The two biggest colonial powers, who violated the sovereignty of a few 100 million people, declared war on Germany to defend Poland's sovereignty, while Poland's violated the sovereignty of a few 100,000 Germans. As I said, self-determination was not for everyone. I think it's probably one of the most hypocrite situations of history. But Of course, hypocrisy doesn't end there, because a few weeks later the Soviet Union also invaded Poland, which would soon be occupied by both Hitler's and Stalin's armies. Tell me, did Stalin receive the war declaration for violating Poland's sovereignty? No. No, he instead received an alliance, some help, and finally he will get not only Poland, but half of Europe. And Churchill, the great hero, was all supporting those blunders. But Churchill was not yet Prime Minister. He was called back as First Lord of the Admiralty and was in favor of invading Norway, a neutral country, probably to cut the iron supply from Sweden to Germany. In fact, he actually violated Norway's neutrality by sending warships into Norwegians' waters. And Germany became aware of the invasion plan because Churchill, who was often not very sober, would have talked too much about it. So Germany decided to invade Norway before Britain could do it. Of course it was evil, but again here we have another disaster caused by government intervention. Churchill, who was mostly responsible for this disaster, was then rewarded and became Prime Minister because the blame was put on Neville Chamberlain. Many people of the time, including Prime Minister Lloyd George, reached the conclusion that Britain attracted Germany into Scandinavia by violating Norway's neutrality. So the Allies and Churchill refused to make peace, therefore continuing their state of war against Germany. They have a great part of responsibility for what will follow. They unchained the destructive forces of war, with all the unintended consequences, against Germany, who did not want war with them. So in May 1940, Germany decided to launch its Blitz through the weak spot of Belgium and Holland to avoid the Maginot Line, and was able to beat France in a couple of weeks. Of course, invading those countries was evil, but it's what happened when things like wars are set in motion. I guess Germany did not want to wait for Britain to bring more troops like 20 years before and launch an attack on its soil. Just imagine how things could have been different if the Allies had accepted a peace offer and the war had been contained to only Hitler and Stalin. Imagine how the world could have been different. And then came the famous Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, the so-called finest hour for Churchill. Because in the mythology of World War II, the noble and heroic British were only defending themselves. No, not at all. The Battle of Britain came because Churchill refused all possibilities to end the war. He even said to the radio, "We shall seek no terms. We shall tolerate no parley." Just remember when you visualize the German bombers over London that all that could have very probably have been avoided by not declaring war on Germany or by having accepted its peace offers. It's also very important to say that it's Britain and Churchill who started to bomb German cities many weeks before Germany would reply by bombing British cities. Churchill had openly wished for his own cities to get bombed to help his propaganda in the United States, where most people were against the war. And even in Britain, there was a lot of people who were in favor of peace. Also, one of the first raid of the Luftwaffe over Britain was to drop leaflets of a peace offer translated in English. I guess you did not know that, no? It doesn't fit very well with the dogma we've been told so many times that it was Germany who was responsible for the war. Hitler would have told his generals that the attack was intended to bring down Churchill, not Britain. Hitler even said that the fall of the British Empire would mostly benefit other powers. But Germany lost the Battle of Britain. They never built any heavy bomber. The British had the home advantage, their fighters could stay longer in the air, and they had a good system of radar. and the funny thing about that is that Churchill, when he was in the opposition, criticized the spending of money for the radars. So Germany, who was only at war with Britain, was not able to get air superiority and cross the English Channel with like 30 kilometers of water. But we are told that Germany would have crossed the Atlantic Ocean to invade America and conquer the world. This is absolutely ridiculous, and it only serves to scare people into supporting wars. Okay, I admit that there are some speculations in what I'm saying. But when dealing with speculation, I will always prefer to support non-intervention rather than supporting the most dangerous of all government's interventions, that are preemptive war. I strongly believe that Hitler did not want war with Britain and the West, and there are many reasons to believe this. Of course, I'm not saying that we have to believe every word Hitler said, but Hitler really renounced to some obvious advantages in order to achieve peace with Britain. Hitler had criticized the Kaiser for having a war fleet in some colonies because it was a challenge to Britain, and it pushed Britain toward an alliance with France. Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, "Consequently, no sacrifice should have been too great for winning England's willingness. We should have renounced colonies and sea power and spared English industry our competition." In 1940, when France was defeated, Hitler ordered his army to stop at Dunkirk, letting more than 300,000 soldiers escape safely and be available to fight in the future. Hitler would have spared them in order to make peace with Britain, but Churchill refused the peace. Hitler also renounced to take the French fleet. It's Churchill who ordered to attack and destroy some of France's warships in Algeria, killing many French sailors, even if the French promised to scuttle their ships before being captured. According to Ralph Raico, Churchill would have lied and tried to suppress the evidence. Hitler also invested huge sums of wealth to build the Siegfried Line that protected Germany on its western border. I mean, we can ask the question, why doing that if he wanted to conquer France? Then, what were Hitler's ambitions? Okay. First, he wanted to overthrow the Versailles Treaty, rearm, and reunite the German people by taking back the lands that belonged to Germany. I mean, I see nothing wrong with that. I don't see why the right of self-determination should not apply to Germany, and also why she should not have an army while she is surrounded by nations who have some. Then Hitler wanted to have an empire. And yes, imperialism is evil. But the thing is, Nazi Germany's ambition were not against Western powers. It was against Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Also, it's not like if wanting to have an empire was suddenly a new evil that required that all free people sacrifice their life to prevent. I mean, Britain, France, Belgium, and Holland were already empires against the will of hundreds of millions of people. You cannot fight imperialism by supporting another imperialism. Because yes, World War II was an imperialist war initiated by Britain, who did not want to have a rival on the continent. Churchill said, "You must understand that this war is not against Hitler or National Socialism, but against the strength of the German people, which is to be smashed once and for all, regardless of whether it is in the hands of Hitler or a Jesuit priest." And yes, Hitler wanted to get rid of the Jews, which was very evil. But at first his plan was to exile them. The extermination only started at the end of 1941, when it was no longer possible to force them out, and after the Allies had blockaded their immigration. The Wannsee Conference was in January 1942. It's also quite possible that the extermination plan came as a revenge when Hitler realized he could no longer win the war, because most of the world was against him. Hitler said, "If the international Jews should succeed in plunging the nations into a world war, then the result should not be the Bolshevization of the herd, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." Ralph Raico said that Churchill's refusal to make peace may in fact have doomed European Jews. Also because most Americans were against the war. For a second time, Churchill had to work hard to bring America in the war. In 1940, he sent a team of 300 agents in the United States. They made propaganda, intercepted mail, tapped wires, cracked safes, and blackmailed those who were against the war. It was illegal, of course, because the United States were neutral. But Roosevelt had told Churchill that he would wage the war without declaring it. The American ambassador to Britain, Joseph Kennedy, even said that he was afraid Churchill could place a bomb on his ship to exploit the incident. Churchill also gave to Roosevelt a false map of a German plan to conquer South America. It's no surprise when I think there's a quote who said that truth is the first casualty of war. And yes, it's true that Nazi Germany declared war to the United States, but it was after many months where the United States were de facto at war against Germany in the Atlantic. Germany had no possibilities to harm America. The only reason that makes sense is that Germany declared war to the United States in the hope that Japan would declare war to the Soviet Union, because in December 1941, Germany had failed to beat the Russians that had just launched their first counterattack 2 days before Pearl Harbor. The Second World War could also have ended sooner in Europe, which would have meant less death and destruction. But again, Churchill in many ways is responsible for making it last longer. He refused to listen to the German people that were against Hitler. Churchill was also behind the horrible Morgenthau plan that aimed to deindustrialize Germany at a point that millions would have starved. And he was in favor of the unconditional surrender of Germany. Knowing that, many Germans became convinced that they were better to fight until the end. Whew. So, Churchill really chose to side and help the worst of the two evils. Because yes, Nazi Germany, for all its evil aspects, was still better than Stalin's communism. Under Nazism, you could own some property. A farmer could own a land and produces food in order to make some profits, which is very important for people not to starve. It was far from an ideal free market, but in the 1930s, everywhere the state was gaining power. It was also possible to leave Germany if you did not like it. But under communism, you are prisoner of the system. If you try to escape, the government will kill you, or even kill your family if you escape. Communism was an ideology that aimed for world domination, and it killed a lot more people than Nazism. So, a big part of Europe was given to Stalin's communism at the end of the war. Just look at a map of Europe after the war, and you see it's very red. Do you remember why the Allies went to war against Germany? It was to defend Poland. Well, Poland was given to Stalin, and also East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Albania. Churchill bears a lot of responsibility for that. And it was at the cost of a war that killed tens of millions and destroyed some generations of created wealth. Churchill himself had proposed and accepted such a division of influence with some percentage ratio he wrote on paper while he was negotiating with Stalin. Of course, in 1939, Churchill had condemned the division of Poland between Hitler and Stalin, but then he gave Poland to Stalin. Communism also spread to China and to many of the countries occupied by Japan. The Allies and Churchill also have their share of responsibility in this. First, by helping Stalin to win the war and conquering Eastern Europe, they enabled him to help other communist struggles. But also, quite ironically, after the so-called Good War against Nazism, many European countries fought anti-colonial movements that wanted their independence in Africa and Asia. And it was easy for those movements to get the moral high ground with the so-called ideals of the war and the Atlantic Charter that again proclaimed the right of self-determination. Many of those anti-colonial movements were attracted by communism as an alternative to Western colonialism, which for all its evils was still better than communism. Churchill's supporters like to say that compared to the dying Roosevelt, he was better to see the communist danger. Let's look at this, shall we? In 1937, Churchill said that if he had the choice, he would prefer communism over Nazism. As soon as 1941, he would have given unconditional support to Stalin. Also, to please Stalin, Churchill declared war to Finland, who was fighting against the Soviet Union. Churchill would also have suppressed the evidence of the Polish officers killed by the Soviets at Katyn. In 1944, Churchill said, "Deep-seated change have taken place in the character of the Russian government, and a new confidence grew in our heart towards Stalin." In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "I have very nice talk with the old bear. I like him the more I see him." Churchill also gave to Stalin a crusader's sword, which is a symbol for the defense of Christianity. Churchill also laughed of his predecessor Chamberlain by saying, "Poor Neville believed he could trust Hitler. He was wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong with Stalin." Neville Chamberlain is viewed in mainstream history as the fool who appeased Hitler by letting a few million unhappy Germans being reunited to Germany rather than start a war. But Churchill, who wanted to start the war earlier, is viewed as a visionary genius while he appeased Stalin by approving that maybe 100 million Europeans be forced against their will to live under a horrible regime that is communism. I mean, what a nonsense. Churchill is a monster that belongs with the worst war criminals and genocidal maniacs of history. He was obsessed with a hatred of Germany and was ready to do anything to destroy it, even if it meant replacing Nazism with communism. Churchill also helped Tito to take power in Yugoslavia. When asked about the fact that Tito was transforming his country into a communist dictatorship, Churchill replied, "Do you intend to live there?" After the war, Churchill also approved the forced repatriation of 2 million people into the Soviet Union. That means people who fled or did not want to be there. And that includes Russian prisoners of war liberated by the Allies that were considered traitors by Stalin. And even those who fought on Germany's side because they hated so much communism, some of them preferred to commit suicide rather than going back, because they knew what awaited them. Churchill even agreed to force back Cossacks, who were not even Soviet citizens and who fought against the Red Army during the Revolution. In his book The Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn openly said that both Churchill and Roosevelt acted with stupidity and short-sightedness. Churchill knew that communism was evil. He had himself decried the Bolsheviks as bloody baboons and fool murderers. He even admired Mussolini for his way of fighting communism. But Churchill, with all his dishonesty, gave a famous speech in Missouri in 1946, where he said that an iron curtain had fell upon Europe. Once again, Churchill took glory for exposing a problem he was hugely responsible to bring about. Like most wars, the Second World War did not make the world safer and most peaceful. At the end of the war, a new conflict emerged, the Cold War, between the very socialist Soviet Union and the less socialist West. In 1948, the Soviet Union got their first nuclear bombs. China would get theirs in 1964. Though the United States and the Soviet Union never fought directly, they waged many proxy wars into which the United States supported many regimes from fascist to Islamic, which in most cases led only to more unintended disasters, like most governments' intervention do. One of those tragedies happened in Iran in 1953, where the democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh was removed from power by a Western intervention, which Churchill was very influential to bring about. Oh, and by the way, Churchill had been a lobbyist for the oil company British Petroleum that was against Mossadegh. Today we still live with those consequences because an Islamic regime came to power as a reaction to the Shah installed by Western imperialism. Of course, Churchill's war crime don't end here. His favorite, for which his name is forever associated, is the massive firebombing of civilians in Germany, which killed around 600,000 people. And Churchill lied, claiming that only military targets were bombed. About the destruction of Dresden, for which Churchill was largely responsible, he would later say, "I thought the American did it." Churchill would also have said to another MP asking for more bombings, "You and others may desire to kill women and children, but the British government's desire is to destroy military objectives. My motto is business before pleasure. This man is a monster. At a point by Churchill's decision, half of Britain's industrial production was making bombs and bombers. All that against a country who did not want war with Britain. Of course, Churchill supported the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He also approved the creation of millions of anthrax cakes with the intent of dropping them over Germany. It was never done, but the consequences could have been horrible. I mean, could you imagine anthrax would have spread and maybe Western Europe would have been uninhabitable for decades. The island where it was tested had to be quarantined until 1990. This was crazy, and we know that Churchill was often drunk. But can you imagine a drunk maniac who has control over so much power and even weapons of mass destruction? Churchill also opposed any food relief aid to occupied countries that former US President Hoover had organized. Chamberlain had permitted such aid. At the end of the Second World War, it is estimated that 15 million Germans were expelled from their ancestral land in Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, and the Sudetenland. During the process, 2 million of them died. This was all agreed by Churchill at the Tehran conference. Churchill said to Stalin that there would be enough room for those millions of Germans in Germany because millions of them had been killed or would be killed. He also approved the deportation of 500,000 German civilians to go work as slave labor into the Soviet Union as a form of reparation. Churchill was also terribly racist, which is important in the context that the belief of his so-called greatness come from his opposition to Hitler. So for Churchill, blacks were niggers and blackamoors, Arabs were worthless, Chinese chinks and pigtails, and Indians baboos. In 1943, there was a starvation in Bengal that killed more than 1 million Indians. Churchill had, of course, some responsibility in this because the war often produces scarcity of food, but also because apparently Churchill refused any help, saying it would damage the war effort. He also would have said that those who died would nevertheless continue to breed like rabbits. Western colonialism had bad sides. The democide expert Rudolf Rummel estimated that from 1900 to their independences, the death toll could reach 50 million people. Churchill fully supported British colonialism and opposed any independences. Churchill ranted, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion." About the Iraqis that resisted British rule, Churchill said, "I'm strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes to spread terror." And speaking of Iraq, Churchill was Minister of Colonies when modern Iraq was created, forcing people of different cultures into the same state. It's also worth saying that the Royal Air Force had bombed people in Iraq, India, Palestine, Kenya, and Uganda well before they would do it in Germany. I often see people quoting Churchill who said that capitalism is the unequal sharing of wealth and socialism the equal sharing of misery. Again, another myth is that Churchill fought against socialism. It's a myth because Churchill was a socialist. In 1908 he said, "I would like to see the state undertaking new functions." Churchill passed some of the first legislation introducing the welfare state in the form of minimum wage and unemployment insurance. He said that the Bismarckian model of social insurance was wonderful, and he was in favor of many nationalizations. In 1945, Churchill was beaten by the Labour Party, against which he warned of being totalitarian. He even made references to Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom, but again it was blatant hypocrisy. It was Churchill himself who had approved the Beveridge Plan for the post-war welfare state and Keynesian management of the economy. He also said, "You must rank me and my colleagues as strong partisans of national compulsory insurances for all classes, for all purpose, from cradle to the grave." Ludwig von Mises wrote that British socialism was not an achievement of Mr. Attlee's Labour government, but of the war cabinet of Mr. Churchill. When Churchill got back to power in 1951, he added more welfare programs in housing and public work. He also put in place many legislation that gave a lot of power to the labor unions. Ralph Raico said ironically that Margaret Thatcher, who considered Churchill a great hero, would also struggle against those same powerful unions. The power of the state grew enormously with wars, and Churchill was a big fan of war. The state is the real winner of wars, whether it's communism in the East or the welfare state, Keynesianism and the military-industrial complex in the West. Churchill's presence in the Liberal Party was at a time when the liberals were transforming themselves from the classical liberals, those in favor of the free markets, to the liberals of today, which are hardcore statists, pro-war, pro-interventions, and pro-welfare. I'm thirsty. But it's not alcohol, I'm not like Churchill. Okay, so just to recapitulate, Churchill was in favor of all wars. He wished for more wars than actually happened. He wanted to violate neutral countries. He imposed a starvation blockade to force Germany to sign an immoral and unfair treaty. And he said that the war was against Germany's trading capacity. He brought back the gold standard to an unrealistic ratio, causing economic troubles. He was a liar, changing his mind according to what would benefit him. He used lies and deceptions to bring the United States twice into war. He contributed to transform 2 regional wars into full world wars, with terrible consequences, including the spread of communism and possibly the Holocaust. He did all that because he wanted to defend the British Empire, but like most governments in solution, the contrary happened. And after the Second World War, Britain was ruined. She lost her empire, her gold reserves, and dominant position to the United States. There was food shortage, there was food rationing in Britain until 1954, 9 years after the war. And the world was not safe because there was the Cold War. Churchill is to blame for all that. So no, he's not a hero. Someone has to be completely ignorant or brainwashed to believe this. You know, there is no street or pub with the name of Hitler, and his face is on no money after 1945. But Churchill's face and name are everywhere. even in the mind of people who believe in freedom. Unfortunately, Churchill's mythology is still used today to sell imperialist war. George Bush and Tony Blair used the Churchillian mythology to portray the war against Iraq as necessary to remove Saddam Hussein, that would have attacked America with weapons of mass destruction. And like World War II, who spread a worse evil with communism, the Iraq War spread a worse evil with Islamic terrorists. For the neoconservatives, it's kind of always 1938, and anyone who opposes war is an appeaser. When in fact, Chamberlain's decisions were probably better than those of Churchill. Chamberlain's foolishness was to give Poland the guarantee, because without it, there could have been some peace in our time, as he said. It's no surprise that after all those lies are exposed about Churchill and the mythology of the Second World War, that Germany needed to be portrayed as one of the most evil regimes that has ever existed, while communism is lightly criticized. Libertarian historian Ralph Raico concludes that Churchill was a man of blood and a politico without principle, whose apotheosis serves to corrupt every standard of honesty and morality in politics and history. Churchill was not a hero. He was a monster that created more monsters by perverting the noble principles of freedom and courage. Thank you very much for listening. Forgive me for my French-Canadian accent. I cannot do anything about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. I welcome any polite discussion. Most of my reference comes from these books, and none of them are revisionists who deny the Holocaust or praise the Nazis. So, Great Wars and Great Leaders, a Libertarian Rebuttal by Ralph Raico. It's probably my favorite. Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, How Britain Lost Its Empire and the West Lost the World by Patrick Buchanan. Human Smoke, The Beginning of World War II and the End of Civilization by Nicholson Baker. The Costs of War by John Denson. And The Failure of America's Foreign Wars by Richard Debeling and Jacob Hornberger. Thank you very much.